I mean, it's I guess it's part and parcel of what we're talking about. I mean, this idea of, like you know, Blair and Clinton came along and essentially said, look, that's it, we're done. That's it. We're scrapping the whole politics thing. Like, now we will run the show by money. And I think it
Technocracy.
ultimately, and it ultimately, but it did detract greatly from the fact that people stopped making connections between things like their foreign and war
Though, I mean, this is
policies.
capitalist realism, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, like we stopped going, oh, the fact that that's happening in that country, directly because of the involvement of this country. We stopped associating that with any of the policy from this party. We
A,
stopped
mil-
seeing it as politics.
a million people showed up in London on the dawn of the Iraq War. 100,000 was it in Dublin? No
Sounds about
political
right.
party was able to
Mm,
pick up on that. A fucking million people in the streets in London.
mm.
1 million people. Hello, like, am I? That that's enough of a base. Is that not? I have no idea what the size of a base of a party is, but that's a lot of people. Like, on one
Yeah,
issue,
yeah, yeah,
mad. No opposition, no alternative,
no.
and yeah, like you said, no question. But the point here is that that was the politics without frontiers, and we are now seeing politics with frontiers. I mean,
Mm,
Corbyn sort of failed to really hammer home the frontiers he had identified. But everyone else, left or right, there's frontiers popping up all over the place.
mm.
Antagonism. Hopefully, somehow we'll get rid of the far right of these frontiers and we will be left with an agonism.
Huh.
But we'll continue that discussion in the next chat. But this is significant to bring it back to Stephen's question. This is significant to me because I feel that, like, not only is there what we're sensing a trend towards an amplified discourse and an increased interest in that discourse, but there are also sort of cultural configurations where I think I was bringing up the idea that there is a decoupling with the increased level of inequality, much like up to 100 years ago. The society's elite are less concerned with the culture of the working class, whereas, of course, for the last 100 years or so, or 100 years or less, um, that culture has been, well, the cultural intervention that we've been talking about. It's been a tool. It's been paid intense attention by the elite. It was a desperate. It was a cultural war. Thatcher saw that the only way she could get to reassert the traditional hierarchical arrangement in society, um, she knew that a cultural shift had to take place for neoliberalism to be subsequent to follow social democracy, whereas the common sense of social democracy is, like I think we said last time, social solidarity. Somehow, well, through a cultural program, people came to become really suspicious of people on welfare, and this whole um, pov porn thing that came out of a culture in Britain that hated poor people all of a sudden, and hated um, the trappings of poverty. I mean, like, I'm pretty sure I remember, like, Orwell talking about, like, how class was defined in Britain back then, 100 years ago, whatever. Like, smell was a huge thing. Like, you could smell class off people in terms of, like, if they're poor, they smell in a particular way, and if you're middle class, they smell is particularly disgusting to you, and all this sort of thing.
Mm.
Um, but it rose its ugly head again um, once this neoliberal cultural program takes effect, and and solidarity went out the window. And this class division that benefited absolutely nobody except for those receiving surplus value in the upper distribution of wealth. Point where I was going there was that culture was paid an awful lot of attention, a general popular culture, pop culture, which sort of arose around the 60s. Convenient. So my point is that because it's not as relevant, is not as pertinent's the word, the elite just won't pay so much attention to it anymore. There's a substantial decoupling happening, and we will be left to our own devices a lot more. And like the cultural sphere, if it's not fed heaps of cash, it will, just like a city, it'll sort of crumble a bit, it'll become a bit decrepit, it'll turn into a ghetto. And you know, in ghettos you get idiosyncratic cultures developing because there's no longer the sort of uniform feedback between the periphery and the center. Does that make sense? So idiosyncratic sort of cultures can sort of begin to develop among the rubble, and that will leave us. So if the reason that what was the term, you know, the crystal the social incapacity to self-organize is at the hands of this cultural program of neoliberalism, if that is no longer the case, then what? So I suppose ultimately, before we answer that question, which is returning to the very first question, my answer to Stephen's is I'm not sure that okay, so like also brought up last time, Facebook will be less of a cultural tool the more it becomes a security tool. And these cultural things that now separate us, while of course they can continue to do that, the main thrust of funding might not be in that strand of the entity. So it might become decrepit. Where the funding is going is into suppression, for when that main thrust becomes decrepit and people begin to fucking use it in a different way than they're using it now, which might quite possibly be a more networked and a more sort of, well, efficiently networked and collectivizing way. This is the idiosyncratic developments that might happen in a ghetto. That suppression, that's where the money is. That suppression's there to suppress those developments. So say if it was without a digital field, if it was money was being pumped into a city, everyone was happy, but because of capitalism, the rich got richer. They got so rich that they stopped funding the general public. The trickle-down effect dried up what little there was to keep people happy. The poor, the working class part of towns got poorer, began crumbling, weren't maintained. People there stopped reading papers, stopped going to the newspaper. They couldn't bloody afford it. The cinema, to anything. Started coming up with their own music, their own way of speaking, their own way of dressing, their own identities, and started realizing the disparity, the cultural disparity became more apparent in the city, and they start rising up. But because the money stopped going into them, into the trickle-down effect, the money went into security. The elite happened to sort of securitize or militarize, which has been happening for the last 20 years, in actual fact. Militarize police forces and are ready for that eventual situation where the ghetto rises. The police force that was a civil situation became a military situation for such an uprising. So it's interesting that Facebook, obviously what I just said is a hypothetical, is a model, but it's interesting that Facebook is now mostly in the news for things regarding security, national security. So yeah, I think to me things are changing and things are opening up. There's a politics of frontiers, or a politics of frontiers is re-emerging. And yeah, I suppose that would be my answer to Stephen's question. Do you have anything to add to that? I just prolonged
Yeah,
on. Sorry.
no, not at all. No, I think if anything, I I think it's all I could do would be point fingers, perhaps to highlight instances where I agree with you. Um, if anything, it's something that I've noticed. For example, I mean, you're seeing the progressive rise again of organized workers unions in industries, perhaps where it had never really had organized presences before, especially within the digital realm. You're seeing a lot
Good luck.
of, yeah, but you're seeing like a lot of these kind of a lot of new media companies starting to actually see the benefits of organizing union at a union level. Um, Again, in industries perhaps where workers and the people working within it had kind of decided, or it was kind of the given consensus, well, we don't really need this because we're having such, it's such, we're in the new wave of new media entertainment. We have a better working condition to say that of our parents or of our grandparents. So, we're having a load of fun. Why would we need to consider having a workers' union? So seeing the emergence of workers' unions in industries like new media, television, video games, even amongst people, content creators online, for example, starting to take into account their own things like the how they're affected, how their ability to produce and own, I guess, or produce, own, and also make money through their work is being impeded on by the larger bodies. They're seeing the importance of organizing together in that. So I guess what I would say on just on top of that is, yeah, I mean, it's not much to add. It's more just a pointing of fingers to say, yeah, that's also what he's talking about. But I think that's one. I think that's one of the major points that I think is actually been a huge push forward, just for me to see at least. Is seeing the reemergence of things like workers' unions in industries where perhaps it, but due to the kind of the push to neoliberalism, we may have actually may never have been thought to have been needed before,
No,
because
because
you know we were too busy supposedly just trying to get rich
you were born of
off
it.
of it. And so seeing that starting to come around again is quite positive, I feel. And I mean, I think that is, like, in and of itself, that's a huge shift.
Yeah,
You know,
definitely.
I mean, there's, yeah, no, I think, yeah, even in of itself. So I mean, coupling that with the fact that it's something that is also starting to be talked about by, yeah, as I said, like on an in a sort of within an organized kind of work space like that of an industry where people are hired in as workers to work within, say, a company or within an agency, and then also for freelance producers, freelance, even here on a level, you have various factions of workers unions that exist for teachers, for musicians, for new media content creators, and these are things that are being reached out to by organizations like the CNT, and by much more left leaning, as well as the core sort of very historical workers unions groups here. They're also being reached out to by, I guess, more contemporary parties that are coming at it from perhaps an anarchistic or from a left, quite a far left um, standpoint. But they're almost seeing the importance of these pockets of industry, not just to say, oh, it's all just be industry. It's these pockets of new industry that also could benefit from having this kind of organization being injected into it, where, as you said, once we were born into. So, up until that point, it was established we didn't need that. So yeah, no, I think it's a massive push forward.